Hi, welcome. Today I would like to talk about how you can add template based forms in Angular 2. So let's get started. I basically have a boilerplate Angular app running right now, and let's just take the first step to add a form. Basically, in the ng CLI, you can just type in this command ng generate component, and we'll call it the form. So let's just see what it does. It should basically generate a couple of um, classes and HTML file and a CSS file and update the module for the form. So if you look at the form, basically the template that has been supplied is just essentially this. It says form works. And if you look at the TypeScript that's generated is essentially just that. It's saying it's pointing to this HTML file, and there is a CSS file, and that's it. So let's just get this form started with typing in some existing HTML that I have prepared for you, and I'm going to kind of walk you through it so you would know what it is and not be in the dark. But so let's just type in this information here. Basically, this is an HTML form. There is a label. There is an input field to type in the first name, and it's a required field. There is an input field and last name, and we have a button type for submit. And I've added some bootstrap classes to give a little bit styling to the button itself. And there is a submit, and that's pretty much the form we have. And to make sure that this form does show up, what I want to do is look at my TypeScript and see what is the selector. Selector is app form. So I'm going to use this selector in my app component so we can kind of see the form. So hopefully we should be able to see this form in the app, and here you go. So if I look at this form, basically that's all you get. So that's pretty much a standard form. And so next step is what does Angular bring to the table that we can use? So what I'm going to do is kind of walk you through step by steps. And I have a README from where I can copy some things quickly instead of having to type. Basically, I'm going to just have an object called person, and we can add it to the TypeScript file here in the form component.typescript in the class. So we have a model to work with. So this is just the model name and the last name. And what we want to first of all do inside this form is to try to make it Angular specific. So one thing we can do to kind of try things which are Angular specific is basically I'm going to copy certain uh, HTML which I've already prepared, and I'll kind of walk you through this so what makes sense. So let's just replace this existing HTML with that, and I'll kind of walk you through what's the difference. So essentially to include the power of Angular 2, what Angular 2 does is for various forms and various controls, it adds some CSS classes such as valid, invalid, and whatnot. To be able to see those classes, I have put in some debug information. What you can do is you can add what are called template reference variables, and you can name them anything you want. So for example, on the form, I named a variable called a form and I put it in there, and you just start it with a hash. And here is another variable that I have put in is called spy for the first input control, and it's called hash spy. And then the other one is hash spy last, which is kind of the last name. And I put in some debug statements to just see what class names do they have initially. So you can just do this dot notation and you should be able to see the classes. So if I look at my form right now, this is what it looks like. So you can see the form CSS classes that Angular has already added. It has added classes called ng untouched, ng pristine, and ng valid. And let's say, for example, we are only worried about ng valid and ng invalid classes. But as you can see, is it added some CSS classes on the form which you can use to style it. It has added some classes for the input control here, that is untouched and pristine and valid. And here you go. So as you might notice that I have a little green bar here. Let me just increase the size here a little bit. So here you can see that we have a little green spat which is saying it's valid. So it's based on these CSS classes like ngValid. And I can show you the class file itself, which I've added. Is pretty simple. If it's an input or ngValid, the border left is 5 pixels solid green. If it's invalid, it's going to be 5 pixels solid red. So that's what you have in the form right now, and you can use this in this template reference variables to. I've added those just so you can see what it is, but it's really for essentially at this point is essentially for debug purposes, or at least to learn what classes Angular is adding. So the next step is typically for a form you want to get it from ng form, so you typically can include a reference variable like this. So since input is going to be bound to the model, and we want two-way binding so that when we type anything inside the input field, the model changes, and if the model changes, the input field changes. And the syntax for Angular is pretty straightforward. You start with this bracket notation and you put ng model inside it. And here is where we are accessing our person object and the name. So this field is being bound to that name. And Angular does require you to put in a field attribute called name. So we put in name equal to first, and the rest is always there. So this is last name, name is last. So only other thing I've done here in the button is that I have said that it is disabled. If so, you can see the reference variable for the form was test form here. If the test form is not valid, then it is basically disabled. And here we are saying this is the way to call a function when you do a submit. We send the click event, we'll call the on submit function here on the submit. So that's pretty much all there is to it. And if you look at it here, you can see that's going on. So let's say since the first field was required, as you can see, if I type in something else, it is changing the class called ngDirty. And when you exit it, it makes it a field called ngTouched. And you can essentially use it to play around tricks with this. But the simple one you can I've tried here and I'm going to demonstrate is basically, since this was a required field, I removed everything. You can see that the form has become invalid, and also the first class has become invalid, and it's changing the CSS here to red. You will also notice that the submit button is disabled because and then you can add some stuff, then the submit button is enabled. And if I click on submit, it's going to call the on submit button, but I haven't really supplied a function, so that's why I'm getting an error here. So what you can do is basically in the type field you can add an on submit, and then that error should go away and you can just kind of process it. And if I do that, then we should be all good. See, here it goes. And in the submit button, basically you can take your model and do an HTTP call or whatever else you like. But the main trick for forms I found to be very useful, that Angular does make it easy because of its automatic addition of all of these concepts of a field being pristine, untouched, and valid. You can create quite a few complicated scenarios and forms with it. So thank you for watching this short screencast, and if you are interested, I'm going to add this video under Angular 2 forms so that you can refer to it at a later time. Thank you for watching this short screencast, and you have a great day.